Okay, managerial communication students, today we're going to be talking about verbal structure. In other words, how do we build presentations based on how we speak? This is information you're going to be using for things like your telesell presentations later on in the class. So let's jump in. We're going to start off by telling what the differences are between the times we might use telesell versus consult and join. We're going to talk about how we make good use of openings, getting ready to talk, knowing what we're going to say, how we make good use of the closing. Remember, the most memorable parts of any speech are always the beginning and the ending. And we're also going to talk about ways in which you can know that you know your content inside and out. And we're also going to talk about consult and join meetings. The difference being in telesell, we're kind of presenting information or trying to convince people. Consult and join, we might be asking people for information or trying to get them to buy into a concept. A little bit of a different strategy. And the preparation and the way that we do those things is a little different as a result. So we're also going to talk about other times when you may have different speaking situations that require you to be completely what we refer to as manuscript based. That means that you are essentially reading off a script, or you may have to do something off the top of your head, like an impromptu kind of presentation. You may also have to do interviews or team presentations. And we'll talk also about online presentations as well. But let's jump in a little here today. What are telesell presentations? What's the purpose of telesell? The purpose of telesell presentations, you're either disseminating information or convincing people. You're trying to sell your point of view. And that being said, you have to make use of the time that you have and the means which you have to get somebody onto your side. So we're going to talk about how we can do all of these things to make good use of our audience's time and make sure that they're getting the points that we want to be able to have. The opening is your opportunity to hook the audience. The old expression is you get one chance to make a first impression. And I think there's a lot of truth to that. People very quickly judge whether or not they're going to pay attention, whether they're interested in what we have to say. So we want to get them right off the get-go. We want to get them hooked in. So questions you need to know yourself when you're going into this presentation. Is this something that people are interested in? Do you have to work hard to get them interested, or is it a topic they're already into? Is it something that applies to them? For example, if somebody has no interest in a subject or has no bearing on them, it may be very hard to get them to listen to you and pay attention and be interested. Do they know why they are in this meeting? Do they know why they are there to see you? And do they know you? What does that mean? Well, if you are more credible, if you're familiar and credible, they may be more likely to give you attention. Or if you've got a title, or if you've got other kinds of credibility, you may have an easier time getting people to pay attention to you. So you got to tell the audience why you're there, and you may want to decide what kind of approach you're taking. So I like direct approaches. Simply saying, look, this is the reason why we're here, bottom line up front, is always good. Starting off with kind of a false pretense, meaning that you have kind of lied to people to get them into a meeting, to get them to listen to you, you're already putting the audience against you. Be direct, tell them why they're there. There are lots of ways that you can do this as well. You can ask a question. For example, how many of you would like to make $1 million? That's a provocative question. A problem statement. How do we fix what's wrong with HR in our company? Stories or statistics or images, things that get people thinking, are good too if you are a good storyteller or if you've got a relevant image. The quicker you can show the audience WIIT or FT, what's in it for them, the quicker you're going to get them to buy in. People who have no skin in the game for what you're presenting, you may never get them interested. Along with this, you may also want to build your credibility by showing expertise. You can also open with some kind of humor. If you're good at telling jokes, I'll just put it out there, I'm not a good joke teller. I'm good at telling terrible jokes. I'm good at demonstrating how humor doesn't work. I'm not always good with telling jokes. So know yourself on this one, and know also if the humor is appropriate for the situation, and if the actual humor you're using itself is appropriate for your audience. So be cautious with that stuff. So here's some great ways that we can open a presentation. I love this quote. Sadly, in the next 18 minutes when I do our chat, 4 Americans that are alive will be dead from the food they eat. Wow, that's compelling. Gets us thinking. Imagine a big explosion as you climb through 3,000 feet. Imagine a plane full of smoke. Imagine an engine going clack, 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 clack. It sounds scary. Well, I had a unique seat that day. I was sitting in 1D. So we're setting up a story and we're giving people powerful imagery. That's good stuff in terms of engaging openings. And of course, there are some lines that will stick with us forever. Anybody who hears the phrase, "I have a dream," immediately knows Martin Luther King Jr. and knows that that was a very engaging speech that has stood the test of time. Paul is the kind of guy you don't have to worry about introducing your parents to. That's why Linda didn't worry about introducing Paul's to hers until today. So if you are giving a speech at a wedding, for example, this kind of humor might work out really well for you. Here's some ways not to open presentations or speeches. I love this. This is from an actual commencement speech. Boy, can you imagine what the next 45 minutes must have felt like to this graduating class? Show of hands, how many of you really know what goes on at a meat rendering plant? Great way to engage the audience. I love this one. I am so nervous and it's given me gas. I hope I don't fart and embarrass myself. Another way not to open your presentation. I hope you will pardon me, but I had no time to prepare my speech last week. If you do not understand what I'm talking about, please send me an email. I'll do my best then. So we're already giving the audience permission to check out and destroying our own credibility in the process. A great thing to do after you've made the purpose of the speech or the presentation known to your audience, give them a blueprint, give them an outline. Give them some sort of expectation. We're giving them a roadmap for the speech, and you can call it a framework, you can call it an agenda, roadmap, whatever you want to call it, but use titles that make standalone sense. What you're essentially doing is giving your audience a framework to know how much time and attention they need to budget. Let me give you a couple examples. If your agenda or your framework contains topics that are not all interesting to or relevant to some of your attendees, they can choose where they're going to pay attention. They also can determine how far along they are in the speech to know how to pace themselves and their energy as well. So compare your audience to somebody who might be reading your material. A reader gets headings. A reader can go forward and backward in a topic or in a document. You're controlling the speed of the content with your audience. They have only you to rely on. They don't have subtopics. They don't have headings. They don't have necessarily a written agenda. So empathize with your audience by being good to them in this regard as well. So your preview should contain all of the main points you're going to cover in the order you're going to cover them. And again, use bottom line up front. There's great examples on page 87 of our text. So what's the difference between a reader and a listener? Again, a reader can go through the document back and forth, hitting the parts they find interesting or that are relevant to them and skipping the parts that are not. They can read and visibly take in. Most people can visibly take in topics and content more quickly than we can say them. So readers have control over the way they're consuming content. Listeners do not. We need to take that into consideration. So if we start off with good main points and that they are clearly organized. Now, when we're starting off our presentation, generally speaking, you can use subheadings too. Stick with about five or no more than five. I'm not going to say I've never broken it down more than that. I'll never say that I have not gone with more than 5 points, but generally speaking, it's good to keep it at 5 main key points you're going to cover in the presentation. You can have subheadings under those points, but you get beyond 5 and people have a hard time really building mentally that framework. If you got more than 5 points that are all equally important, maybe you need more than one presentation to cover them. So think about that. So use transitions, and what I mean by that is we're going between slides. Give people some context. Where are we? This is the first point or the second point, but tell people how it fits into the bigger picture. So for example, if we're starting off with the introduction, we might say, let's move on to the second recommendation and just use it instead of using numbers or A's or B's. Use strong transitions that tie the content that people are about to consume into content they've already consumed. And at the same token, you might want to give them previews of things that are heading up. For example, later in this presentation, we're going to be talking about specific speaking situations and the virtues of using improvisational speech. You know the things that we're heading toward. That also gives you a chance to build your sense of attention as well. Anytime you get a chance to go back and forth within your presentation, it gives people context. Here's the other thing too, in terms of repetition. By the time you feel like you've said something so much that it's boring you, that it feels too repetitive to you, that's probably enough for the audience. It feels more repetitive to us because we know the content. So when it starts to feel repetitive to you, that means you've probably said it enough. Keep that in mind. So think about this. When we watch television, especially now since we're all watching a lot of streaming, anytime you watch a streaming show, you binge watch it, and by the time the next season comes around, it might be a year or 2 years. There's a reason there are TV vignettes, we call them, things that give us a recap of the last episode or even the last season. Like, for example, previously on Sons of Anarchy. We can do the same thing in our speech by saying in the last section we emphasized these points. In the last section we talked about our new marketing plan. Now that's our backward look. Let's talk about what that budget is going to look like, the forward look. Now we know that it's easy to get people at beginnings and endings. Beginnings, people are excited for a presentation. The end, we can use that for recaps, where people are just happy the meeting is over, for example. The middle is the hardest part because we've got to keep the interest high. It's just like a hamburger. The bun is easy. It's easy to get bread right. It's not easy to get a good burger cooked well. So how do we do the middle of our presentation? Well, you can use stories, you can give examples, anything that gives people something to hang on to, gives them context. You could also involve them in the presentation, for example. Why not get them to answer some questions for you? You can give them questions that are real, meaning you're actually asking them for feedback, or rhetorical, things to consider. I think it's always great in a real-time presentation, whether it's in person or online, to ask people for feedback. It gets them involved. You can even tell people, hey, later on I'm going to be asking you for your input. That means that you're kind of putting people on report. Hey, I better pay attention. This person may be asking me a question later on. Well, how about an effective closing? I don't know how many of you are Seinfeld fans out there. It's a little bit of a dated show. It's kind of getting its second life now in streaming. This is George Costanza. George Costanza was terrible in the office and terrible in meetings, but he discovered the power of the one-liner. So as soon as he would say something funny or entertaining, no matter where he was at in his presentation, he would stop and end on a high note. So I'm not saying you can always just end your presentation right when you had that great zinger, but it's good to know when it's time to close and how to effectively close your presentation. If you are at the end of your presentation, the worst thing you can do if you've got content left over is start the mad dash through the slides. Instead of starting to try to finish every single bit of your content, if you've built in too much content into your presentation, try to hit the key points. Summarize what you have already covered and tell people that if they want to stick around, if time is available, you'll continue, or that you will gladly follow up with them at another time. I'll give you an example. How many of you have ever been in that last class before final exams, and you've got an instructor who all of a sudden has 4 classes worth of material they're trying to cram into a single class so they can say that they covered it? Yes, they will have covered it, and their audience will have retained nothing. There's no point into trying to ramble and cram in a bunch of points at the end of a lecture or the end of a presentation your audience will not retain. Effective use of endings is to recap the content you want them to remember, to recap calls to action, to recap the things you want them to take back to your key audiences. That's an effective use of the end of a presentation. So it's your last chance to make things stick. Give people a summary. Give them what we refer to as marching orders. Tell them what they're supposed to do. You could go back to the opening. Go back to the agenda. Show that you've covered everything. Now, if you go into a question and answer, I want you to remember this too. If you go into a Q&A section at the end and you are saving your questions for the end, after the last question is taken, do what we call a second ending. That gives you the last word. It gives a structured end to your presentation. The worst thing to do with any presentation is simply say, well, that was it. See you later. Always have an ending, and if you take questions, do a second ending so people can be assured that is truly the end of the presentation. So far, that's gotten us through the idea of effective openings, preparing what to say, and we've also just covered effective closings, remembering your content, and we're going to get next into consult and join, how to remember our content. Remembering your content sometimes can be one of the most difficult things an instructor or a presenter can do. The biggest advice I could give you is don't rely on slides. Don't rely on notes. Have an idea of where you want this presentation to go, even if it's high level, before you start talking. If you get turned around in your presentation, your basic knowledge of your content will always serve you well. Here's the basic test. For example, if I were unable to, from memory, give you a Cliff's Notes on this presentation, I probably don't know my material well enough. If you can't explain it in common terms, you probably don't know your material well enough. Even if you're going to be speaking to a technical audience, you should be able to explain your content in common words. Own your content. What I mean by that is before you're in front of a room full of people, make sure that you're spending time rehearsing how you deliver this stuff, at least the first few times you do this content, with somebody who is a friendly or unfamiliar audience. Unfamiliar meaning they may not know the content. Cover it with your girlfriend, your boyfriend, your friend, your spouse, whoever. Make sure that they can understand the point you're saying. I'm a big fan of extemporaneous style. In other words, not reading off of note cards, not reading verbatim. I know a lot of people use index cards. I'm not a fan. I know some people use PowerPoint notes when they're using a slide presentation. I'm not a fan of that either, but that's up to you. It's acceptable. It's acceptable to have note cards. It's acceptable to have some notes. If you are going to have notes, use note cards. Don't use big pieces of paper. Reading off a page, reading something verbatim and sounding like Ben Stein from the movie Ferris Bueller's Day Off. You know who I'm talking about. It's an old classic movie. Bueller, it gets boring to the audience. So if you are going to use notes, make sure that you have big print, they're easy to read, so you're not just staring down at your notes. If you are memorizing too much of your speech, you can also come across as canned. Generally speaking in business, the more conversational, then better. And the great example I like to use, I don't know how many of you are musicians, really great improvisational musicians, in particular jazz players, can look at chord charts and they use those charts to guide what they're going to play, but they don't play it verbatim. That's classical musicians read the sheet music and play it verbatim. We're making blues and jazz here more than classical. Not that there's anything wrong with classical, but this is business communications and it's a little bit more extemporaneous. So I think it's great if you are using notes. You can use what's called presenter view if you're using slides. Again, if you're using PowerPoint on a regular basis, when you connect to a projector, you can still see on your own laptop your own notes. I encourage you to be prepared and knowledgeable about your subject, but don't be so prepared that you're coming across like it's canned. Spontaneity is good. A little nervous energy is good too. Whether you're a musician or an athlete or somebody who just talks in front of people and enjoys it, that little bit of nervousness sometimes really makes for a more energetic presentation. So our question and answer, again, is something we're going to capture. We talked before about the necessity for the second ending. It really is another opportunity for us to show our credibility, to get the main points of the presentation back in the closing, to make sure that we are demonstrating we know what we're talking about and giving people an opportunity to ask questions. Now, there are different strategies when you should do Q&A. Some people believe you should always save it toward the end. Some people believe you should do Q&A during the session. We'll cover some of the pros and cons of both of those approaches. So when do you do Q&A? Well, you can tell the audience, hey, we'll do it as questions come up, or we could save them for the end, or we might say, for example, hey, I'll answer questions, but if you get into substantial questions, things that take up a lot of time, hey, we'll save that for the end. There's lots of reasons to manage Q&A depending on your content, your own personal style. So answering questions while they come up is great. If you got somebody who's asking a question who is so interested in the answer to that question they can't focus on anything else in your presentation, if you answer that question immediately, you're freeing them up to free up their focus for the rest of their presentation. The bad side is that can also throw you off your time frame and your schedule. One of the other pros, you're giving immediate feedback to your audience, and they can give immediate feedback to you, but you can also derail the presentation. One of the other pros is the audience may be more involved. There's really no cons to the audience getting to ask questions during the presentation, other than if somebody only has one thing they care about, they may not pay much attention to the rest of the presentation. That's not necessarily a con if they're getting out what they want out of it. If you're saving questions for the end, one of the best parts is you save your schedule and you can control the timing. One of the bad parts is somebody may not have understood a key point, and they also may lose interest because they really wanted their question answered and they checked out because that's all they could focus on. Some of the pros are too that if you save questions for the end, you've got time to think about things and think about how you want to answer the questions. And again, people sometimes lose interest. And another spot on this as well, if you save the questions toward the end, somebody can ask you a really tough question you were not anticipating, and you're stuck at the end of a presentation with no time to say something like, we'll save that toward the end. And it can be in a really rough spot for a presenter to be in. So how do you take question and answers? Well, first of all, generally speaking, we should know what kind of questions we should expect. If I'm doing a tell-sell presentation on a new product, I should expect that people should want to know what it can do for them and what it's going to cost. Show your understanding, meaning if somebody is asking you a question, number one, demonstrate to them you understand their question. And number two, show that you actually know the product, service, or initiative, whatever you're presenting. You also have to stick to the objective. There are going to be people who try to derail your point by asking questions that have nothing to do with content. We see that all the time in political press conferences, and that's not something that goes with either political party. It goes to both. We try to get people off topic. And the more you can get everybody involved in Q&A, the better. Let's flesh these topics out a little bit. So preparing in advance means, yes, we can pretty well guess the kinds of questions we're probably going to get. You may want to have some extra material prepared. In other words, if people are asking for deeper parts of the content, they're asking for more detail, be ready to give it to them. You can role play too, meaning prepare for your presentation. Think about if you were somebody who was in the audience, what would you want to know about what's being presented? Frequently asked questions. There are things you should just know the answers to. Again, value, cost, action, details, any of the things that are key parts of your presentation in the first place, know what those are. Okay, when I say stick to your objective and organization, stay on message. There are going to be times where people try to pull you into conversations that have nothing to do with what you've been presenting. You have a time-challenged audience. You could even be in a situation where you're being drugged into something that's political or controversial. Sometimes it's okay to answer the question and nothing more. Somebody asks you a question, answer it, and you don't have to elaborate. You don't have to give them more content. Is this going to cost us more money? Yes. Is this going to be a difficult transition? Yes, it is going to be difficult. Maybe you don't want to elaborate more. If somebody's trying to hit on information that's going to be covered in a later presentation, maybe give them a partial answer or tell them that we're going to be covering it later, especially if that happens during the presentation. But there are going to be times where you just answer the question and nothing more. There are going to be times, if you're covering a controversial topic, you may not want to give people too much information depending on the sensitivity of that information. So when I say working the room, when somebody asks you a question, yes, after that person asks you the question, work the room. When you're answering that question, make contact with everybody in the room or out in your virtual room, not just the person who's asking the question. Why is that? Well, number one, it makes everybody else feel included. Number two, it makes the person who's asking the question maybe even feel a little less awkward. Nobody likes to be stared at in front of a room full of people, so answer the question to everybody. Keep everyone involved. Well, what happens if you get that answer or that question you don't know the answer to? I will not tell you to lie. I will say the best policy, generally speaking, is to admit when you don't know the answer. There is nothing in the world, in most situations, wrong with saying, I don't know the answer to that question. I can find out and get back to you. There's nothing wrong with that answer. What's more wrong is saying something that isn't true and putting your name to it, especially if you're in a presentation that's being recorded. Let's say, for example, you do know the answer to the question, but it's complicated. You need time to think. repeat the question. You can even turn the question around and say, well, that's an excellent question. What do you think? And that puts that person on the spot and buys you some time. It's okay to even say, I need a second to think about that. That's an answer that most people are not comfortable with, because we in Western society are uncomfortable with silence, but there's nothing wrong. There's far less wrong with taking time to answer a question than to carelessly give people the wrong answer. You can also turn the question back to the entire audience. You could ask people, how would everybody else handle this? You're engaging them as well. And again, we can think about it for a minute. If you've got like a whiteboard or a flip chart or something, write the question down. It buys you some time, gives the audience something to focus on, and gives you time to think about how you want to answer the question. So there can be all kinds of challenging questions. You can get somebody, for example, who's asking you something that's very confusing. It could be somebody who does not speak well. It can be somebody who maybe was hard to hear, or the question itself may simply just be a poor question. In that case, paraphrase it. Make sure you're getting the question right. If they just repeat the same question when you ask for clarification, maybe even say, well, let's talk after the presentation, instead of putting yourself in a situation where you're going to be stuck trying to actually decipher what the question is. Then you get some folks who want to hijack your presentation. They're asking a quote-unquote question. It's really not a question at all. It's a statement. We see this in political press conferences all the time. It's really tempting all the time to call somebody out and say, okay, well, what was your question? Take back control by paraphrasing their comments and thank them for saying something, and you move on to the next person. Yeah, they got their statement, but it's better than getting into a confrontation most of the time. There may be times in your presenting life where the confrontation is unavoidable, but if you can't avoid it, it's generally good to avoid confrontation. And then we'll get folks who will sometimes ask a question out loud and then answer it themselves, because they're giving themselves a platform. Your job as the presenter at that point is to try to get control back of the presentation. So if somebody's answering a question or putting you on the spot, again, there's nothing wrong with you asking them a question. Okay, that's an interesting point. So where do you think we need to go with this? Ask them that. See what they have to say about it. There's nothing wrong with doing that. If the audience is internal, when possible, when I say internal, meaning you're in your own office, try to take back control of the presentation. If it's something you're presenting to a client, however, somebody who maybe likes to hear themselves talk, and we all have these situations, you got to know your audience. Sometimes it's better just to let them have their say, but you also have to read your own audience, and you need to know your own audience in that regard. So what if we have people who are hostile? This could be a presentation. Imagine if we're talking about pay cuts. Imagine if we're talking about eliminating parts of our healthcare program. All of a sudden, even if it's not your fault and it was not your decision, you've become the target for a bunch of really angry people. Well, what do you do in that situation? Well, sometimes it's good just to try to remember that it's not you that they're actually angry at. They're angry at the decisions that are being made. Sometimes you just got to take emotion out of the response and try to say, look, I know you're upset. I don't like it either. But hey, I'm suffering the same changes you're changing. If it is something that you're not going to find agreement on, sometimes you just got to say, we're going to have to agree to disagree and move on. Again, you're going to know with your own audience what you're going to be able to accomplish, and also based on how sensitive the topic actually is. Then we've got something we call the back channel. The back channel is everybody in a classroom is on a laptop, quote unquote, doing schoolwork, or on a cell phone, or using social media, email. That's all back channel. It's a simultaneous communications channel that's happening during the official presentation. I find it's very powerful in the 21st century, not to ban the back channel, but to capture. We're going to talk about what some of your responses could be. Some of the pros to allowing people to use the back channel, whether it's their smartphones, laptops, texting, polling, social media, it can get people more engaged in exploring the content. It can be distracting to the presenter as well and keep people from actually listening to your presentation. It can also get the message out. If people are live tweeting about some presentation, for example, all of a sudden they're talking about you, it can also derail the presentation. If you say something really dumb and all of a sudden it gets shared on social media, we've all seen how that can happen. So how do you deal? Well, you can ask people, please put away your devices and see how well that works. I know as somebody who instructs graduate and undergraduate students, it's a very unpopular thing to say to most classes. You can ignore it and just let it happen. You can accept it, or you can do what I've tried to do, which is embrace it. I make extensive use of polling software and asking people to go online and search for information. Those are things you can do as well. So if you are going to use the back channel, we want to allow people to use devices, for example. Make your key points online friendly. What do I mean by that? If you are using terminology that's current, if you are using points that are going to allow people to search for them online, or you're using hashtagging, for example, in your actual presentation, that's going to be a big plus. If you're also live streaming your presentation, for example, that can be a plus as well. Or if you're asking people to tweet at you, if you're asking them to tag you in tweets or other social media, create a hashtag and get it out there prior to the event. I think it's also handy as a presenter, if you are using the back channel, to have somebody monitoring your social media for you. That's tough to do while you're trying to be an actively engaged presenter as well. So again, during the presentation, if you're making use of the back channel, acknowledge it, encourage people to use it. You may also want to take breaks during your presentation and allow people to use their social media, for example, to post Q&A, or you could use that as the only means for Q&A. It's something we're seeing now with a lot of online presentations, particularly since the advent of COVID, where instructors or presenters are not taking questions live. They're taking them through chat or through tweets, for example, and that way they've also got an archive of the questions that have been asked. You can also make sure that if you are taking breaks in the presentation yourself, that you are addressing key topics through social media and keep people focused on your social media accounts. And again, I think it's also one of these things in a smaller presentation, if it becomes distracting, ask for a show of hands. And if more people think that the social media or back channel approach is distracting than helpful, then maybe you cease using it during the presentation. All right, well, that takes us to our next section. We talked about Q&A. We talked about how to remember our content. We also talked about how to use the back channel as part of the entire presentation. Next, we're going to be going on to consult and join meetings in addition to tell and sell. Well, we know that tell sell is all about doing sort of a one-way presentation of our primary information. Consult and join means that you're actually either asking people to give you information or to come on board with a cause. This requires a little more audience consideration as well. So let's get into what some of the differences are in terms of how this presenting medium works. So what's the deal with consult and join? Well, again, you might need information from someone. You might be polling them. You might be conducting a focus group. Or you might want to get them on board with a strategic objective that's challenging or something that your company is trying to institute change. Maybe it's not a popular idea within your company and you need champions to be able to come on board with you. That's what consult and join is all about. So when you're focusing on this, you have to think about why you're doing the meeting in the first place. Again, you're asking for information. That being said, if you're doing most of the talking, you need to consider how you're conducting a consult join presentation. You are making use of their time. Think about how you can make best use of the time of the people who are giving it to you, and also how you can get the information you're looking for. Let's be realistic. Most of us hate going to meetings because we see them as wastes of our time. So how do we make it worth the time of the people who are willing to come? I think that it's absolutely a great idea if you're doing one of these kinds of meetings, put the agenda out and put it to your attendees ahead of time. Why? Well, number one, so they can see why they're attending, because you're actually getting a favor from them. They may even have some suggestions for you. And also, if you're giving them these objectives and giving them kind of a heads up what the meeting is about, you're sort of telling them, hey, look, I'm expecting you to participate. I'm expecting you and hoping that you'll give me your ideas. That's all stuff we need to do prior to the meeting. I think it's also good to make sure people know their roles, and that includes us. If you're doing a consult join meeting, for example, you should be taking the role as facilitator. It lets you to be either an impartial or a partial participant. So it might not be a bad idea to get somebody else to do it. That lets you participate more as a participant and to be impartial. So to recap that point, if you're able to get somebody to facilitate the meeting, you can actually be an active participant and less partial in it. That being said, there's nothing that will keep you from being a good facilitator if you want to do that yourself. Just know that you may be a little bit more biased. I think it's also good, when possible, to set specific times the meeting will begin and end. Why? Well, we can give all of our energy up if we know how long we're going to be there. I remember I had a supervisor years ago who would never tell us the end time of meetings. You didn't know if you were going to be there for a half hour or for 3 hours, and you had no idea how to time your energy. It was like being in hell. And so I think the idea of setting a time and having somebody monitor the time is a great idea. If you get somebody who can take notes for you so you don't have to, that's great as well. And again, if you can even have somebody who's taking, what we refer to as a scribe, who is taking verbatim notes. This day and age, even something like Zoom. Zoom's got an auto transcription feature. So when you're recording things on Zoom, for example, you can automatically create a transcript. They're not perfect, but they're pretty good. So the idea of just recording the meeting even might be good if it's appropriate to record it. I think sometimes it's a little dangerous to record meetings too, because things just sometimes come out in speech that maybe are offensive or dangerous, that someone maybe did not intend as such. You can always strike those from the minutes if you are instructing somebody who is serving as your scribe. Again, if you're doing a consult join meeting, it should be interactive. You shouldn't be doing all the talking. I think that the ways you can do this by having an effective opening, by setting expectations and making it known that you want to hear from people. Get the meeting started on time. Show people you value their time. Tell them what the agenda is and what it's all about. Establish ground rules. For example, when one person's talking, everybody else listens, or are using Robert's rules, the old way of running a meeting. The sooner you get people talking, the more interactive the meeting is likely to be. How do you get people to participate more? I think that during the meeting, if you avoid asking yes or no questions or things that you can find out through your own research. Open-ended questions show people that you're looking for their input. Don't ask yes or no questions. Ask open-ended questions. What do you think about this new proposal? As opposed to, do you like this new proposal? Sometimes, for example, if somebody asks a question or makes a comment, paraphrase it. It makes it easier for the people who are taking notes. And anytime you're doing polls or asking people for input, record the input. I think that the idea of encouraging people to speak, whether you're nodding your head or saying, I see, okay, keep the conversation moving. If there is a disagreement between you and one of the attendees or several of the attendees, let it go for a little bit. Let the conversation happen. And again, if you're doing all the talking, you're doing it wrong. So one of the reasons that people hate meetings so much is they don't see the point. Well, we sat in that meeting for 2 hours, nothing came out of it. Make it worth an attendee's time. Show that something came out of it. Make decisions during the meeting. You can take votes, for example. You can do consensus, meaning that everybody sort of comes to a consensus through discussion, or you can do a formal vote. When you're done with the meeting, send out minutes, send out an email to show people that you actually listen to what they said, and if it resulted in an action plan, and hopefully it did, because after all, that's why we do meetings in the first place, tell people what the action plan is. So that gets us through consult and join meetings, and we're going to get to one other section tonight, which is about other speaking situations. Tonight or today, depending on what time you're watching this. So there are certain situations that fall outside of telcel and consult join. So let's talk about these. Again, you've got other speaking situations that maybe are a little different. Manuscript speaking means you are literally reading a speech. I think there are very limited times in most of our lives where this makes sense. For example, if you're reading something word for word, it's either because it's a very important speech. It could be something, for example, that's religious, that's ritualistic, like if you're doing a prayer that is meant to be word for word, or if you're recanting somebody's speech, for example, or if it's just a formal important speech, you might have to do it word for word. When you're writing these speeches, don't say things that people would never say. Like, we're not in old England anymore. You're not going to say thus and therefore very much. It might be therefore, but you're not going to say thus and thou. Say things like you would actually say them. If you're going to be reading this verbatim, make sure that you make a font that's large enough for you to easily read. If you're reading off a page and not index cards, leave the bottom third of the page blank. Why do I say that? So you're not staring down at the lectern the entire time. If you have the top 2/3 of the page, you're going to be more likely to make eye contact. It's the same reason why we elevate our laptops when we're on a Zoom call, so people aren't staring up our nostrils. In this case, we don't want them staring at our foreheads as our eyes hit the bottom of the page. Anytime that you are taking a paragraph, even if it results in some extra white space, don't take a paragraph onto a second page when possible. End the paragraph before the page breaks. Don't staple the pages. You've got to rip them apart. That being said, have a paper clip or something to hold them together and number your pages so that if you drop them, you can reassemble them. If there's a word you want to emphasize, bold it or underline it so you know that this needs to say something big. So in terms of emphasis, we can decide with this sentence. I love how the emphasis changes the entire context of the way we say it, or the way we say it changes the entire context of the sentence, I should say. Is she going to the concert? 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 Again, it's emphasis. If you are getting into impromptu speaking, and when I say impromptu, I don't just mean extemporaneous. I mean where you're literally going to have to make it up on the spot. Generally speaking, it's not a surprise if you're the maid of honor or the best man in a wedding. You're going to be called upon to do a speech. Have some points ready. Make sure that what you're going to say are things that are appropriate that people can relate to. Nobody is ever going to complain, man, that best man's speech was too short and too concise. They are going to, however, complain if you went on forever. If it's possible to give a preview, I'm going to tell you about some of the great times I had with Matt back in the day. Give them a preview where this is going so they can pay attention the whole time. Online presentations, we get to our technology section in this class. We're going to talk more about this. But since COVID-19 has hit us, we're all doing more online presentations these days. And all of these key points, the idea of giving people reasons for the meeting, setting objectives and sticking to agendas, for example, giving people materials in advance, having good visual aids, that stuff's even more important because we're all spending so much time looking at it. And I think we're all getting a little burned out on it, to be honest with you. So the more effective you can be with the materials you would normally use in person, and the better use of people's time you can make. In addition to the fact you may also have to really instigate policies about people speaking one at a time or how you handle Q&A. That also goes into online presentations as well. If you're doing a multi-site presentation where you got 5 or 6 people on, for example, you definitely want to make sure if you've got multiple people gathering around a computer, make sure you got somebody who's designated as leader. And anytime we're doing Zoom or video calls, it's always a good idea to have a phone number. Why? How many times have we been in Zoom calls where the internet freezes and we still got to get somebody online? Make sure that they have a phone number also for you, or the number where they can call into the conferencing service. Every Zoom call, for example, you can actually call into. Test, for example, if you have somebody you've never done a Zoom call with before, if you have the opportunity to do a video call, a Zoom or a Google Hangout or whatever technology you're using, do a test call with them. See what the internet is like. I think sometimes it's good to start with a welcome slide, so when people log on to your call, they're not necessarily just seeing you staring at them. They've got a slide up. And again, because we are talking over a flat medium, video is not like being there, not exactly. You might have to overemphasize. You might have to be more enthusiastic. If you're using hand gestures or body language, you might have to be even more emotive with those things. Okay, who has ever done a media interview? Here's the deal. When you get in front of a camera and you're being interviewed by a journalist, it's going to move more quickly than you can ever think. Time speeds up. So prep in advance with this stuff. And here's what I mean. If you've built a relationship with a reporter, get their contact info and email. Why? So you can get copies of transcripts, you can get copies of video later on, and also you've got a medium with which to be able to clarify information. Those interviews go quickly. If you have a business card, you have a better likelihood they're going to get your name and your title correct. Think about what questions they're going to ask you and be ready to answer them, especially if it is going to be a tough question. When I say think about both audiences, think about the people who might be watching internally, people from your company watching you speak, and people from the general public who are watching you speak. Have you said your key points in ways that people who are not familiar with your company can easily understand? Are your company managers going to be happy with the way you presented content? Again, it goes fast. Know what you're being asked and answer specific questions. Many people have gotten themselves in trouble by answering questions in a vague or opaque manner or giving too much information to a journalist who takes them down a line of conversation that had nothing to do with what they wanted to cover or the message that they wanted to get out, or even worse, got them into controversial subject matter. If there's certain phrases you want them to repeat, for example, if I were doing an interview about St. Francis, I would probably repeat "become that someone" until the journalist was tired of hearing it. And I would have specific stories ready to go that would emphasize my point. If you're in studio doing this, you're dealing with all kinds of lights, all kinds of noises, monitors. Ask where you're supposed to look. Sometimes you might be using multiple cameras, and dress for the camera. Here's what I mean by that. Pick plain clothing. Patterns typically don't look good on camera. Plaid doesn't look good on camera. Herringbone doesn't look good on camera. Pick solid colors that are in good high contrast to your skin tone. I tend to be very fair skinned, so I wear darker colors that contrast with my skin tone so I'll look good on camera, at least as good as I'm capable of looking. If we're doing a team presentation like you get to do all the time in school, make sure that you are structuring for content, not for the number of team members that you have. Here's what I mean. If you've got a slide presentation, simply switching from one team member to the next for every slide so that everybody gets to speak is not a great strategy. Have team members take on specific content for themselves. Make sure that you've got transition points. Oh, at this point, I'm going to hand over to Jill, who's going to talk about effective use of media. If you are doing a team presentation like any group work, make sure your visuals between individuals when you've created your slides or your message, if you're doing a verbal presentation, works well. Practice it together and make sure you're choreographing who's handing off to whom. And folks, that is our presentation on tell, sell, consult, join, and other speaking arrangements. I hope you have a great day, and I look forward to interacting with you soon.